The Democracy That Delivers podcast is brought to you today by the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center at SIPE. This is the podcast where we talk about corruption in its many forms. And now to your host, Frank Brown.
Welcome, everybody, to the Democracy That Delivers podcast. My name is Frank Brown, and I'm the director of the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center here at SIPE. I'm very pleased to bring you this podcast sponsored by the Center, the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center, and welcome a special guest host, Louisa Ayvazyan, who's the head of office in Armenia, the SIPE office in Armenia. Welcome, Louisa.
Thank you, Frank. It's a pleasure to join the conversation.
And I'm also pleased to be joined today by Hasmik Tigranyan, who I just saw last week at a big anti-corruption conference in Paris in person. And it's great to see you here, Hasmik, on video. Welcome.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for the involvement.
And Hasmik, of course, is the acting head of anti-corruption policy development and monitoring department at Armenia's Ministry of Justice. So let me set the stage a little bit by describing to listeners who may not be familiar with Armenia, both in terms of geographic and demographic and political terms. So for our purposes, in an anti-corruption sense, Armenia is especially interesting because not only has it historically had high levels of corruption, and we'll talk a little bit about that in more detail later, but it also went through in 2018 what's called the Velvet Revolution, where democratic reformers, after massive street protests, came to power, headed by now Prime Minister Nicole Pashinyan. So that was back in 2018. And since then, pretty robust system of anti-corruption architecture has been put in place. And Hasmik is unusually well placed to describe that architecture and also, for our purposes, to drill down on what it means for the business community in Armenia and globally. So to give listeners a sense of where Armenia is and what it is, it's a former Soviet republic. It has about 2.8 million population. It has an 8 million population diaspora, which is quite interesting. Many of those folks in Russia and the United States, but it has a pool of talented emigres or Armenians in the diaspora to tap into as these reforms progress. Geographically, it's in a pretty tough neighborhood. And Armenia, of course, is bordered by Georgia and Iran and Turkey and Azerbaijan. So that's, for our purposes of this podcast, that's an interesting geography because obviously heavy sanctions are in place on Iran as well as on Russia, which is to the north. So with that, let me jump in, Hasmik, with a few rapid fire questions to get a sense just what the architecture there in Armenia is like when it comes to anti-corruption. So welcome again. I'll run through some central elements of the anti-corruption landscape. And if you could just give us a quick comment on the absence or presence of each one. So let's start off with, does Armenia have a special court for anti-corruption cases?
Yes, Armenia have it in 3 levels. So first instance, appeal court and court of cassation, specialized anti-corruption court.
Super. And is there an anti-corruption prevention agency?
Yes, Armenia also have a preventive body, which is an independent body.
And when you say independent, meaning it's independent from the government?
Independent from the government, from financial side, and from independent side, as it means that it has all the independence required by the UN Convention Against Corruption. So high level of independence.
And then related to my first question about an anti-corruption court, is there a special anti-corruption prosecutor?
Yes, we have special department of specialized anti-corruption prosecutors. Besides that, we have another independent body, anti-corruption committee, which is an investigative body. And the prosecutors oversee the legality of the criminal proceedings. So we have specialization in all levels.
Thank you. And one final question before I turn it to Louisa. Hasmik, in your position there at the Ministry of Justice, what is your function?
Ministry of Justice is responsible, my department is responsible for development of anti-corruption policies and laws, for monitoring and evaluation of anti-corruption, implementation of the strategy and other reforms, as well as we are a national coordinator of coordination of Armenia in international sectorial organizations. We coordinate the process of implementing international obligations in the field of anti-corruption sector, and as well as we coordinate the activities activities of anti-corruption focal points in state bodies.
Frank, if you let me, thank you, Hasmik, for explaining this. You mentioned several anti-corruption related institutions. Could you provide more information on how they operate in practice?
Yes, I can bring an example of how operate is. For example, in case of Corruption Prevention Commission, which is an administrative body, it deals, for example, with verification of asset declarations and declarations of officials. And in case when a Corruption Prevention Commission finds elements of crimes in declarations, the CPC does not put administrative fine, but send the case to the Prosecutor's General Office. And these specialized prosecutors then send the case to the Anti-Corruption Committee, where they deal with the respective case and criminal investigation is being implemented. This is one example how they cooperate. On the other hand, for example, Anti-Corruption Committee as an investigative body can have itself a case where it will need, for example, CPC opinion in a case, or it will need that CPC should conduct verification of the declaration or verification of existence of conflict of interest. And in that case, Anti-Corruption Committee applies to CPC. On the other hand, there are another method of cooperation. For example, CPC has access, and all these anti-corruption bodies have access to operative intelligence data, and CPC, during its activities, can request for such data and receive it. And also, CPC can have request information to all state bodies and get it from all the registries in Armenia that exist in Armenia, the same as Anti-Corruption Committee. So they have all the access to all the information is needed. Another example of cooperation could be cooperation between Prosecutor General's Office and Corruption Prevention Commission. Besides the mentioned institutional structure, we also have department dealing with confiscation of the property of illicit origin, which is a civil confiscation procedure, and the specialized body is in the staff of prosecutor's office, general prosecutor's office. And during that process, this investigation, this study of the illicit confiscation study includes also declaration in the verification part, and that part also, again, is being done by CPC. So it means that all our anti-corruption body cooperate with each other. Even there are stages in cases that are cooperative. So
yes. Hasmik, that's very, very useful. Just to follow up on that question, during a recent visit to Yerevan, the capital of Armenia, where you are now with the Ministry of Justice, we had a chance to meet with the head of the CPC and got a sense of how they've grown in recent years from 4 people to, I think, like over 60 people. So tremendous growth in the prevention agency. And also a sense that they're within Armenian society, they've come to be respected and looked upon as a impartial source of judgment and information about corruption. Could you very quickly give us a sense? You described all these different institutions and how they work together, but in reality, outside of the capital, say Yerevan, in Armenia as a country, how do the Armenian people look upon these different anti-corruption institutions? Do they see them as a genuine sort of way to fight corruption? Or is there still some skepticism and uncertainty?
We do not have conducted separate study devoted on this, but during different studies of public perception on anti-corruption issues, the study showed that general public is aware of these anti-corruption bodies. They have good sense, and they do hope, they still have a good high level of hope that everything will be fine, and they hope that these agencies will help in further fighting against corruption. And what is interesting that during this period, we also conducted a campaign, public awareness campaign for awareness on our anti-corruption bodies and their functions and generally the reforms in anti-corruption sector. And we conducted those activities not only in social media and Facebook and in Yerevan, but also in Marzis and in region. And besides that, together with CPC, we organized trainings for local communities and for local society. So we anyway try to include all the society. And in that sense, our plans are to be continued in sense of public awareness campaigns.
So that's one of the real challenges, I think, for the anti-corruption community is that we can do awareness campaigns, we can do trainings and workshops, but often it's hard to tell what the impact is, what difference is actually being made. What, in your opinion, and I understand it won't be scientific based on a study or a survey, in your opinion, What difference has the creation of all these different institutions made? What's the difference for Armenian people?
When we look into the statistics, we can see that after the creation of these institutes, we have lots of numbers increase of cases. So we have lots of number increase in claims, in people started to be much more tend to apply to state bodies, to these specialized bodies. And what is important that each of these state body has its special task. CPC task is prevention. Anti-corruption committee task is investigation. So each of one know what can bring for the society the important thing that by creating this institutional framework, we ensure that fight against corruption is continuous, and it helps that even strategy is not important. Even that you have the agencies and they are permanent agencies and they have everyday task to fight against corruption, it's also an achievement, I think.
Frank, if you let me just to remind to the audience that CPC is the Corruption Prevention Commission for everyone to follow the direction. A quick question, Hasmik, you mentioned the strategy. So we know that you have recently been developing the new anti-corruption strategy. So it's interesting for the audience, I also think, to know how this new strategy differs from the previous one, especially in terms of its connections with the private sector.
In private sector, there are differences, but in general sense, there are no differences in a sense that we have the aim to continue our reforms. So that's why the reforms that we made during the implementation of the previous strategy, we want to make those institutions stronger. We want those reforms that we were made to be in practice effectively implemented. And what is different in regard with private sector is that now private sector is a separate strategic aim. Fight against corruption in private sector, where in that strategic aim, we have set of directions where we are planning to include business to business, business to state actions in order to ensure from one side business integrity, on the other side to mitigate all those risks that create corruption risks for business and make business environment much more competitive, open, and so on. And here we have directed actions towards public procurement issues, competition issues, tax and customs issues. We also plan to strengthen human rights defender office in sense of a specialized body for business like a business ombudsman sample, to make human rights defender department stronger to fully implement the competencies of business ombudsman, and in that sense to protect businesses too. Besides, we are planning for especially private sector to conduct lots of public awareness activities in that sense. On the other hand, we are going to apply stricter rules for state-owned enterprises and make anti-corruption compliance mechanisms for them mandatory. And besides, we are planning to review corporate governance code at last, and to create mechanism that will create incentives for state bodies to private sector in order in different ways to create initiatives for adoption of corporate governance code and anti-corruption compliance measures.
Thank you, Hasmik. That was really helpful, quite comprehensive, and I hope we can come back to a few of those themes if we have time before the podcast ends. One of the things I wanted to ask you about was that since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022 and the ongoing war there, we've got in place a very comprehensive set of sanctions now designed to try to limit and the Russian war effort and and isolate the Russian economy from the rest of the world as a way to stop the war. In addition, of course, we've had longstanding sanctions in place regarding Iran, which is geographically adjacent to Armenia and one of its trading partners, and Russia too, longtime trading partner and a member of an economic union. And so I wanted to ask you, and this is, I know it's new and it's changing quickly, but I wanted to ask you, to what extent do those sanctions regimes, and Armenia's stuck between these two big trading partners that are heavily sanctioned by not just the US and the European Union, by other countries elsewhere. What does that mean for the anti-corruption landscape? Because typically when we have sanctions, there's a lot of money to be made in evading those sanctions illegally, right? Smuggling, and you can imagine all the different ways you can make money evading sanctions. What does that mean in practical terms for Armenia and your work?
Saying sincerely, we didn't feel any difference. So it's a good thing that we continue our fight against corruption as it is. And maybe Ministry of Economy can better answer to these questions. But in our case, maybe the main is that the state now is trying to help businesses a lot. So maybe not for fight corruption, but there are of course some burden on state, and there are lots of state aid provided to private sector to solve those issues. As really our economic entities had some issues. Increase in prices and so on, but for generally for the Ministry of Justice and for anti-corruption sector, so we continue our reform as it was, and even COVID, war, and nothing stopped us in our way for fight against corruption. So
Thank you. That makes sense. That's a difficult question to ask, and things are fast moving on the sanctions front. So it's understandable that the Ministry of Justice may not have the latest figures and be on the front lines of that. I wanted to give listeners a little background about where Armenia stands globally in terms of anti-corruption, and then turn it back to Louisa to return to the theme of how the anti-corruption activities that Hasmik is describing impact the business community in Armenia. But first, I'd like to make a shameless plug for the corruption risk forecast, which is something that it's an anti-corruption tool that SIPE supports for a couple of years now. And we use it to scan the globe and use a whole variety of data points to come up with a forecast, a sense of what's to come, but also a snapshot in time of where specific countries lie. So according to the corruption risk forecast, and you can find it at corruptionrisk.org, according to the forecast, Armenia is ranked 46 out of 129 countries globally. In the region, it's ranked 7 of 16, so right about in the middle. And then for countries that are in the same income group as Armenia, it comes in at 16 of 36. So again, pretty close to the middle. One thing to note is that since the Velvet Revolution back in 2018, and with Nikol Pashinyan being elected prime minister, we've seen a very steady and noticeable increase in budget transparency, in reducing administrative burden, judicial independence, press freedom, and then e-citizenship. And these are all components of the corruption risk forecast that look at a country's performance based on data, not on perceptions, but on hard data. So setting that up and setting up some of the ways that Armenia is improving on this front that impact business. Louisa, I'll turn it over to you to touch upon that aspect.
Yes, thank you, Frank, a lot. I would just like to add a few words on what Hasmik said in regards to the strategy. Just for the audience to know that with SIPE support, we have recently established the Business Integrity Club, where we do the verification of the members in terms of their anti-corruption compliance and good governance and corporate governance. So I think that this is a direction where we can cooperate together. And my question goes to, as a continuation to what Frank mentioned, can you provide more information on these anti-corruption institutions' impact on the private sector environment mainly?
There are no specific studies like this, but generally stating that there are specific issues. For example, private sector also knows about anti-corruption institutions, and I know that some of them apply to the anti-corruption institutions. But generally, with the help of the SIPE and this corruption risk assessment study, we learned that again there are a lot of to do with private sector in sense of fight against corruption, and for that's why we have separate strategic aim in that sense, and we want to understand the impact of those institutions in private sector. At this time, we have general imagination, we have opinion of a private sector on what they think, how they think. They have lots of fear, for example, in regard with introduction of criminal liability for legal persons, issues in regard with disclosure of beneficiary ownership. So some burden is also on private sector. But in any case, now we are conducting lots of public awareness activities to make them the understanding that all these are important. All sectors are part of the state in fight against corruption, and it also useful for them to have those constructions in place, and especially in case of criminal responsibility of legal persons, it's also useful for the officials of private sectors themselves, as according to the previous regulation, all the burden was on physical person. But due to these new regulations, for a crime, criminal legal person can be just liable, pay the damages, and everything will stop. And the official of private entity will not go to jail. But in previous regulations, in any case, if there is a criminal element and the crime is established, so when there was a verdict, the director or other high official of a private company went to jail in any case. But these new reforms helped also to burden this responsibility from physical persons to a legal person. So it's also important to have a high level compliance level on the other hand, on the other side to have this clear good mechanism. And what we are planning for the new strategy, we are planning to introduce existence of anti-corruption compliance as incentives for minimizing the punishment for cases for legal persons, or in some cases even to releasing from responsibility. So these are important measures, and both have good sense for businesses too. Besides that, we have another important reform in anti-corruption sector, which is introduction of whistleblowing system and anonymous whistleblowing portal, where all entities and all personages, all citizens, all entities can whistleblow anonymously.
Yeah.
And yes, everything is closed. Nobody will know who they are, and that we can say is also important change in our reform.
That's very useful. So picking up on that, so Hasmik, you described in some detail all the different procedures and changes that take into account the needs of the business community. And I understand on paper and in law and regulations that all that's moving forward. But often the business community, especially I know foreign investors, when they're looking at a country like Armenia and they're trying to figure out, do we want to invest here? Do we want to build a factory here? Do we want to open an office here? Those assessments take place sometimes, yes, based upon the laws and regulations you described, but also in informal ways. And they often will seek out conversations with people like you in government and people like Louisa, for that matter, as well, and chambers of commerce and business associations. Hasmik, could you describe a little bit anecdotally, in your experience, what you're hearing from potential foreign investors? What questions are they asking now that are different from 3 or 4 years ago? And what is your overall sense of their interest in Armenia?
I myself haven't been asked any questions, but as long as I know, of course, there is a change. Everybody sees that there are lots of transparency. There is no systematic corruption anymore. So there are competition in markets are even good. So we have fair market play. So lots of things have been changed, and in that sense, I think everybody see the results of what we are doing. And of course, we also give importance to the opinion of private sector. So what we did, yes, now we have Anti-Corruption Policy Council, which is headed by the Prime Minister. In that policy council, all anti-corruption bodies, stakeholder bodies, civil society are there, and there is a requirement that at least 2 private sector NGOs should be there, and we have NGOs there represented. And in anti-corruption working group or developing strategy, we also have businesses all there represented. And
that makes sense. Yeah. So just drilling down a little bit, you said that everybody can see the results of the anti-corruption campaign, and you described the different ways for public-private dialogue and engaging the business community. What can they, very quickly, because I know Louisa has a very good question coming up next on beneficial ownership transparency, but very quickly, Hasmik, what are those changes that they're observing? Like what are, let's say, a foreign business looking at Armenia, potential investment, what's changed there? What's changed in Armenia?
The biggest change that I can is that increase of integrity in state bodies, increase of meaning of being responsible, anti-corruption, existence of just anti-corruption institutions also is well in this whistleblowing system. As every investor know that if there are issues, they have state bodies. And what is important, this business ombudsman like institution that we are gonna to make in the framework of human rights defenders office, it's also important for investors to understand that they are in a good sense. Besides that, I'm aware that the Ministry of Economy has investment council, and they have different initiatives. Yeah.
So when you say increased business integrity in the government, what you're And just to clarify for the listeners, you're saying there's less likelihood that a government official would ask a business for a bribe. Is that right? Okay. So that's the sort of the bottom line.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that it is. And also there are code of conduct. So there are sanctions in place, and public officials know if they want something, they will be at least administrative and also criminal sanctions. So there is a fear of posting something.
That's great. So you've described, I think, in a compelling way, both the formal institutions and what exists on paper, and then what's changing on the ground in a sort of person-to-person level. So with that, we just have a couple of minutes left. I want to turn it to Louisa to talk about one of the bedrocks of any anti-corruption effort. Louisa?
Yeah, so just I will try to be as short as possible. Hasmik, you again mentioned some important directions such as e-procurement, beneficial ownership, and we have been following the reforms, and we have learned that nowadays, in order to participate in the e-procurement, the company, the business have to declare their beneficial owners. So what are the main challenges while implementing the beneficial ownership reforms? And have you heard any feedback, especially from the private sector?
The requirement is new. The requirement is for legal entities, as like in other countries, in our country also, there is huge of resistance, especially for private sector who do not want to be in a such sense accountable. But it is important to have those declarations. Again, of course, there are issues in as the system is new. There are lots of information to fill. State registry office, on the other hand, needs some further resources to explain those entities how it should work. But it is important, and especially for public procurement, it is important, and it is a big achievement to have them required to disclose during public procurement, as it is it's one of the main goals of ensuring fair competition in private sector and during public procurement, and to reveal those cases where, for example, public officials can do benefit for their own businesses. So it's being done for prevention of those kind of cases. And in sense, of course, there are lots of issues in helping businesses, especially SMEs, for filling these declarations, and also the system is still being developed. It's a new one, and new strategy is gonna to be structured on a further development of this mechanism of making the lives of all easier, not to burden business at the same time. On the other hand, make the state easier to have all the information. So all the reforms are being continued as on the way to have reform, and at the same time not to burden businesses and generally the society.
And that's a great topic to end this podcast on, because it's so central to the work of any anti-corruption effort. And the work that you both have done in Armenia is significant enough that I often see both of you in different international fora. And I think, Louisa, you'll be heading off to Estonia in the fall to talk about the work in Armenia. Hasmik, I see you probably more than anybody else from the region at various anti-corruption conferences, speaking very articulately and to the point, as you did just now, describing why this is such a cornerstone. With that, we're running out of time, unfortunately, but I wanted to give a big thanks to my co-host today, Louisa Aybazyan, who's the head of office from SAIP, joining us from Yerevan, the capital of Armenia. And then, of course, Hasmik Tigranyan, who's the acting head of anti-corruption policy development and monitoring with the Armenian Ministry of Justice. Thank you both for joining us today.
Democracy That Delivers has been brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. For more information, please visit saip.org.